4 minutes and 11 seconds. That's how long my heart was stopped. That's how long I was clinically dead on an operating table while 7 colleagues I'd trained shocked my chest, desperately trying to bring me back. I'm 92 years old and I've been a cardiac surgeon for 43 years. I've held a human heart in my hands more than 6,000 times. I've watched hundreds of people take their last breath. I thought I understood death better than most, but I was wrong. What happened to me in those 4 minutes shattered everything I thought I knew about consciousness, about death, about what happens when our bodies stop working. And here's what terrifies me most about sharing this. I'm a man of science. I've spent my entire career in the world of evidence and measurement. I've dismissed near-death experiences as neurochemistry, as oxygen-deprived hallucinations, as the brain's final electrical misfires. But I can't dismiss what happened to me, because it was more real than anything I've experienced in 92 years of living. There was no tunnel of light, no dramatic reunion with deceased loved ones, no life review flashing before my eyes like in the movies. What I experienced was simpler than that, and somehow infinitely more profound. I felt what it's like to die, and I'm here to tell you, it's not what we've been taught to fear. My name is Dr. William Patterson. I don't have many years left, and I don't care anymore what people think of me. I care about truth, and the truth is, I died. I crossed over, and what I found on the other side will change how you think about death, how you live your remaining days, and how you say goodbye to the people you love. This is my story. Before I tell you what happened when my heart stopped, you need to understand who I was, because I wasn't some spiritual seeker looking for mystical experiences. I was a surgeon, a scientist, a man who believed only in what he could measure, cut open, and explain. I graduated from Johns Hopkins in 1957, became a cardiac surgeon in 1967, back when open-heart surgery was still new and terrifyingly dangerous. I've performed thousands of procedures, I've saved lives, I've lost patients, I've stood in operating rooms at 3 in the morning, elbow deep in someone's chest cavity, fighting to keep their heart beating. Death was my constant companion. I saw it every week, and sometimes every day. I watched a 34-year-old father of 3 flatline during a routine valve replacement. I held the hand of a grandmother as she died from complications I couldn't fix. I've told more families, "I'm sorry, we did everything we could," than I can count. And through it all, I believed death was simple. The heart stops pumping. The brain stops receiving oxygen. Electrical activity ceases. Consciousness ends. That's it. Nothing more. I wasn't religious. My wife Margaret was, and she went to church every Sunday for 61 years. She'd ask me to join her, and I'd smile and say, "I see enough on Monday mornings to know that if God exists, He has a peculiar sense of mercy." She never argued. She'd just kiss my cheek and say, "You'll understand someday, William." Margaret died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. I was 88, and for the first time in my career, I couldn't fix something. I couldn't operate my way out of the problem. I couldn't save the person I loved most. I held her hand in hospice while she faded. Her breathing became shallow, then stopped. Her pulse disappeared under my fingers. I watched the life leave her eyes, and her last words to me were, "I'll see you again, William. I promise." I nodded. I smiled, because that's what you do when someone you love is dying. But I didn't believe her. I believed she was gone. Completely. Finally. That 61 years of marriage had ended absolutely when her brain stopped functioning. I believed consciousness was just neurochemistry. When the brain dies, you die. There is no you that continues. There is no reunion. There is just nothing. For 4 years after Margaret's death, I lived alone. I consulted on research projects. I mentored young surgeons. I stayed busy because busy meant I didn't have to think about the empty house or the empty chair at dinner. Then, in March of 2023, I started having severe abdominal pain. Gallstones, acute cholecystitis. At 92, you don't wait. It had to come out. The surgery was scheduled for March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. Margaret used to make corned beef and cabbage every St. Patrick's Day. It was one of her quirks. I thought about that the morning of surgery. I wasn't nervous. I'd been under anesthesia before. I knew the risks. At my age, cardiac events, stroke, complications were all possible. But I trusted the surgeon doctor, that Patricia Chen. I'd trained her myself years ago. She was brilliant. I remember lying on the operating table, the cold room, the bright lights, the anesthesiologist, young man, couldn't have been more than 35, asking me to count backward from 10. I remember thinking, this is routine. You've done this 1,000 times to other people. You'll be fine. I got to 7, and then my heart stopped. I didn't know my heart had stopped. There was no pain, no panic, no sensation of something going wrong. I was counting backward, 7, 6, and then suddenly I wasn't on the operating table anymore. I wasn't anywhere. I know that sounds vague, but I need you to understand. This wasn't like a dream. Dreams are fragmented, nonsensical, blurry. This was clear, coherent, more real than waking life. I had nobody, but I was aware, completely, perfectly aware. More aware than I'd been in years, actually. Now my mind felt sharp in a way it hadn't since I was in my 30s. There was no space around me, no light, no darkness, no up or down, no tunnel like people describe in the books. Just presence, pure awareness existing without a physical anchor. And the most overwhelming sensation was peace. Not happiness, not joy, just peace. Deep, absolute peace that I'd never felt in 92 years of living. All the anxiety I'd carried for decades, about patients, about outcomes, about Margaret's death, or about my own aging, it was just gone, dissolved, like it had never existed. I remember thinking, with perfect clarity, oh, so this is what it's like. Then something shifted. I became aware that I wasn't alone. I didn't see anyone. There was no figure, no angel, no deceased relatives waiting for me. But there was a presence. Something vast and aware that was somehow paying attention to me. I can't describe it better than that. It wasn't a person. It wasn't God in the way religious people describe God. It was just awareness itself. Consciousness observing consciousness. And I understood things, not through words or thoughts, but through direct knowing. I understood that I wasn't my body. The body was something I'd inhabited, used, and identified with. But it wasn't me. The me that was aware, that experienced, that thought, that was separate from the physical form lying on that operating table. I understood that death isn't an ending. It's a transition, like walking from one room into another. The body stops working, but whatever animates consciousness, whatever makes us aware, that continues. I understood that Margaret had been right. "I'll see you again" wasn't religious hope, it was truth. Because consciousness doesn't end. It changes form, but it doesn't end. Then I felt something that I can only describe as communication. Not words, not thoughts, just understanding being transmitted directly. And the first understanding was, "You're safe." The second was, "Everything is exactly as it should be." The third was, "This isn't the end of your journey." And somehow I knew what that meant. I was being given a choice. I could stay, whatever staying meant in this spaceless, timeless place. Or I could go back. I thought about my daughter, Sarah, 62 years old now, with grandchildren I'd watched grow up. I thought about the research project on valve replacement I'd been consulting on. I thought about unfinished conversations and things I'd never said. But mostly, I thought about what I'd just learned. If death is just transition, if consciousness continues, then the specific timing of when you make that transition might not matter as much as what you do before it. And I realized I had things I still wanted to do. Not big things, small things, human things. I wanted to tell Sarah I loved her. Not in passing, not casually, but really tell her. I wanted to apologize to people I'd hurt over the years. I wanted to live without the fear of death that had shadowed my entire medical career. I chose to go back. The return was brutal. One moment I was in that peaceful awareness. The next moment I was violently slammed back into my body. Pain. Immediate, crushing pain. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes. Someone was pressing on my chest. Someone else was adjusting something. What the sounds of the operating room, beeping monitors, urgent commands, the hiss of the ventilator, all flooded back at once. I wanted to tell them I was okay. I wanted to tell them what I'd just experienced, but I couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except lie there while my newly restarted heart struggled to maintain rhythm. I woke up in the ICU 18 hours later, intubated, sedated, surrounded by machines and monitors. Dr. Chen was there. Her face was pale, drawn. I could see she'd been crying. She took my hand and said, "Dr. Patterson, you gave us quite a scare. Your heart stopped during surgery. We coded you for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. 7 rounds of defibrillation before we got you back." 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Medically, I should have had brain damage. 4 minutes without oxygen typically results in permanent cognitive impairment. But the neurological exam showed nothing. No deficits, no damage. Dr. Chen called it a miracle. I didn't correct her, because I knew it wasn't a miracle. It was just what happens. The first week of recovery, I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. I'm a doctor. I know what happens during cardiac arrest. I know about hypoxia, about the brain's desperate attempts to preserve consciousness as oxygen levels drop. I know about DMT release, the neurochemical some researchers think the brain floods itself with during death. I know about temporal lobe seizures that can create feelings of peace and transcendence. I tried to fit my experience into those frameworks. This was just my dying brain creating a final hallucination. This was just oxygen deprivation producing feelings of peace. This was just random neural firing that my pattern-seeking mind interpreted as meaningful. But none of those explanations held up, because what I experienced wasn't dreamlike. It wasn't fragmented or surreal, and it was more coherent than my normal waking consciousness. There were no visuals, no tunnel of light, no deceased relatives, no life review, just pure awareness and understanding. And the knowing, those direct understandings about consciousness continuing, about death being transition, they didn't feel like beliefs or hopes. They felt like facts, like suddenly understanding how gravity works or why the sky is blue. 3 weeks into recovery, one of my former residents visited, Dr. Michael Torres. We'd worked together for 15 years before he moved to Seattle. We talked about medicine, about mutual colleagues, about his kids. Then he asked, carefully, "Did anything unusual happen during your arrest?" I looked at him, and something in his expression told me this wasn't casual curiosity. "Why do you ask?" I said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I coded during a climbing accident when I was 28. Before medical school, I was dead for almost 3 minutes, and I experienced something. But I've never told anyone in medicine because it doesn't fit with how we understand physiology." That conversation opened a door. Over the following months, I started asking colleagues, carefully, privately, if they'd encountered patients who reported near-death experiences. The responses were striking. Nearly every physician I asked had at least one patient who'd described something similar. Awareness during cardiac arrest, a sense of peace, communication without words, knowledge that death wasn't an ending. And most of these physicians had done exactly what I would have done before my own experience. Charted it as post-resuscitation confusion, attributed it to hypoxia or medication, and moved on. I started reading research I'd previously dismissed, studies on near-death experiences, investigations into consciousness during cardiac arrest, cases of patients reporting accurate details from their out-of-body perspective that they couldn't have known. And I began to consider something I'd never seriously entertained in 43 years of medical practice. What if consciousness isn't generated by the brain? What if the brain is more like a filter or a receiver, something that focuses and constrains consciousness rather than creates it? Think of it like a radio. The radio doesn't create music. It receives and translates signals that exist independently. Break the radio, and the music stops playing through that particular speaker. But the signal itself continues broadcasting. Maybe the brain works similarly. It doesn't generate consciousness. It receives it, filters it, translates it into the specific experience of being a particular person in a particular body. When the brain dies, the radio breaks, but the signal, the consciousness, continues. I'm not saying I know this is true. I'm saying my experience suggests it might be. And for the first time in my life, and I'm willing to admit that the materialist framework I've operated from my entire career might be incomplete. Science is extraordinary at explaining what we can measure. But consciousness might be one of those phenomena that exists partially outside the boundaries of measurement. That doesn't make it supernatural or mystical. It just makes it not yet understood. The most profound change in me wasn't intellectual. It was emotional. I stopped fearing death completely. and not in a reckless way. I still value my life, still take care of my health, but the existential dread I'd carried for decades, that tightness in my chest when I thought about my own mortality, was simply gone. Because I now know, not believe, but know, that death isn't an ending. The body fails, but awareness continues. Consciousness transitions. Margaret was right. I will see her again. Not in the literal, physical sense, but consciousness will recognize consciousness. Awareness will meet awareness. I'm 93 now. It's been over a year since my heart stopped, and I've spent that year thinking deeply about what my experience means for how we should live. We spend so much energy trying to extend life. More years, better health, longer longevity. As a cardiac surgeon, I dedicated my career to giving people more heartbeats, more time. But what I understand now is that the quality of your awareness matters infinitely more than the quantity of your years. I've seen patients in their 50s so consumed with anxiety about the future that they're not actually present for any of their life. And I've seen patients in their 90s who are more alive, more aware, more engaged than people half their age. When you understand that consciousness continues, the pressure to accumulate time eases. What becomes important is how present you are in the time you have. For 4 years after Margaret died, I believed I'd lost her completely, that our 61 years together had ended absolutely. But what I experienced suggests that's not true. The connection we built, consciousness recognizing consciousness, that continues. Not in a way I can call on the phone or touch physically, but in a way that's more fundamental than physical presence. This changes everything about grief. Margaret's body's gone, but the essential her, the awareness that animated that body, the consciousness that loved me and laughed with me and shared life with me, that hasn't disappeared. I've watched fear kill people. Not directly, but fear of death paralyzes. It makes people refuse necessary treatments. It makes them sacrifice quality of life, trying to avoid the inevitable. It makes them miss their present moment because they're terrified of their final moment. And that fear is based on a misunderstanding. We fear death because we think it's annihilation, the end of everything we are. But if consciousness continues, and my experience strongly suggests it does, then death is just transformation. You don't need to live in terror of something that's as natural and inevitable as birth. Since my cardiac arrest, I've reconnected with my daughter Sarah in ways I never did before. We'd had a good relationship, but it was surface level. We talked about weather and grandchildren and safe topics. Now we talk about death, about meaning, about what really matters. I've told her things I never told her when I thought I had all the time in the world. I've apologized to people I hurt. A nurse I was cruel to 30 years ago during a stressful surgery. A colleague whose research I dismissed unfairly. My daughter, for all the times I chose work over her childhood moments. Not because I believe in karma or divine judgment, but because I understand that how we treat each other matters. Our connections matter, and the impact we have on other consciousnesses matters. If you're older, like me, and you're afraid of what's coming, let me tell you what I learned. The transition is gentle. There's no pain, no struggle, just a quiet shift from one state of awareness to another. Your consciousness doesn't end. It changes. Like water changing from liquid to vapor. Still water, just in a different form. and the people you love, you will recognize them again. Not in the physical sense, but awareness recognizes awareness. Love recognizes love. If you've lost someone, let me offer you this. They haven't disappeared. The body is gone. The physical form that housed their consciousness no longer functions, but the awareness that made them who they were, that continues. You can't call them. You can't hold them. But the connection you built with them, consciousness to consciousness, that remains. They're not gone. They've just transitioned to a different form of existence. And I'm sitting in my study as I record this. The same study where I spent 40 years reviewing surgical cases, writing research papers, agonizing over patients I couldn't save. The light comes through the window the same way it always has. My hands look the same, wrinkled, spotted with age, trembling slightly from essential tremor. But I'm different. Fundamentally different. I don't know how many people will believe my story. I don't know how many will dismiss it as the delusions of an old man's failing brain. I don't particularly care, because I'm 93 years old, and I don't have many years left, and I'm tired of pretending I don't know things I know. I know consciousness continues after death. Not believe, know. The same way I know my heart is beating right now, or that I'm breathing. I know that death is transition, not ending. Yeah, I know that the people we love remain connected to us in ways that transcend physical form. And I know that the fear we carry about death is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we are. Here's what I want you to take from my experience. You are not your body. Your body is a vehicle, a temporary housing for awareness. When it fails, and it will fail, you don't end. You transition. Death is not the enemy. Fear is the enemy. Fear of death causes people to live half-lives, to play it safe, to defer joy, to avoid deep connection because they're afraid of eventual loss. But loss is temporary. Love is permanent. Consciousness is permanent. So, what should you do with this information? Live like someone who isn't afraid of death. Have the conversations you've been avoiding. Tell people what they mean to you. Apologize for harm you've caused. Forgive harm that's been done to you. Do the thing you've been putting off until someday. There might not be a someday, and even if there is, the you that exists now is the only you that can experience it now. Be present. Actually here. Actually experiencing your life instead of constantly worrying about losing your life. I know some of you think I'm delusional. That's fine. I was a skeptic for 92 years. But consider this. I'm a cardiac surgeon. I've spent my entire career in operating rooms. I know what dying brains do. I know what hypoxia looks like. I know what hallucinations are. What I experienced was none of those things. It was clearer, more coherent, more real than my normal waking consciousness. Dismiss it if you want, but ask yourself, what if I'm right? What if consciousness does continue? What if death is just transition? How would you live differently if you knew that? Margaret told me I'd understand someday. She was right. I understand now that she's not gone, that the love we shared for 61 years didn't end when her body failed, and I understand that I'll see her again. Not in some literal heaven with pearly gates, but awareness will recognize awareness. Consciousness will meet consciousness, and I understand that my time here, however much remains, is precious, not because it's all I have, but because it's unique. This particular experience of being William Patterson in this body at this time will never happen again. So I'm choosing to be present, to love deeply, to live fully, not because I'm afraid of death, but because I finally understand what life is for. I'm 93 years old. I've held thousands of hearts in my hands. I've watched hundreds of people die, and I've died myself. What I learned is this: don't fear death. Fear wasting your life being afraid of death. Be here. Love now. Live fully, because consciousness continues. But this particular form, this life, this body, this precious, temporary experience of being you, this is unique and unrepeatable. Don't waste it. I hope it helps you live a little less afraid and a little more alive.